Join me today for the first part of a multi-part series where we discuss whether or not people in the Marvel Universe are justified in fearing mutants. This is the Geek Cabal channel. My name is Bobby, and today we're going to be talking about the Marvel Universe, primarily the comics, but I suppose this would also be covered in the animated series and the movies, and I'll differentiate where that's relevant. But we're going to be talking about mutants, so we're talking X-Men stuff here, and this is part one. I don't know offhand how many parts this is going to be, but I want to break it down into smaller parts. I might edit it all together to one longer video at the end. For those of you who prefer like the long form content. But basically, the question is, are people in the Marvel Universe justified in fearing mutants? And here in part one, we're going to talk a little bit about why people fear them and possibly the different ways that they fear them, because I think the answer is different depending on which way we're talking about. And then in the future parts, we're going to talk about how X-Men villains exacerbate the situation, and then finally humanity's response, and possibly some other things if I come up with some other things. But for the moment, I'm thinking it's going to be 3 videos here. So anyway, to kind of understand where things are, and I think this is really critical because I always see comments from people who either don't think things through, or just they're not exposed to the rest of the Marvel Universe, or they're not really very well read in the X-Men, because the movies and even the cartoon, as excellent as X-Men 97 was, don't quite explain things. And X-Men 97 did, if you were paying attention to what Bastion was saying. But to explain, the question that always arises is, well, why do people fear mutants and not, say, Spider-Man? Okay, that is a fair question. And the primary reason is this. Spider-Man is one guy, as far as anyone is aware. We're gonna gloss over the fact that, yes, there's a clone in Ben Reilly. As far as Kane might still be alive, one of the other clones. There could be other clones out there. But the general idea is one guy, or at max, a few guys. Okay? The overarching point here is Spider-Man isn't out creating his own race of spider people. Even if his kids do gain the genetics to gain powers, they're all going to be very similar powers. And they, unless it leads to randomly developing the X Factor gene, which it easily could, but then you're right back to, then we're just talking mutants. So, even though technically Spider-Man would be a mutant, and the X-Men really wouldn't be, if I understand the distinction correctly, not the Marvel Comics distinction, but the actual genetic distinction, because Spider-Man mutated at some point after birth, whereas the X-Men are actually born with the X-Factor gene. But anyway, I could be mistaken on that. So anyway, that's irrelevant. The point is, random people in the population aren't just going to pop up as spider people, because they're not descended from Peter Parker. Now, on a super long timeline, yeah, if Parker has a bunch of kids, and those kids have a bunch of kids, and so on, then yes, you could eventually be talking about a population of spider people with spider powers. And given the way Marvel genetics works, an increased probability that some or all of them will develop the X Factor gene as well. So, and then you have someone like, say, the Hulk. Okay, well, the Hulk is a one-off. Like, the gamma bomb should have killed Bruce Banner, but it didn't. Anyone else, and it probably will. Now you have some other gamma mutants running around, like the Leader and the Abomination and people like that. But again, it's a very small number. And they are, for the most part, not out reproducing. And even if they are, they have like a kid or two kids. So, oh no, now there's three of them running around. That's not earth shattering. That's not some random person all of a sudden roids out as the Hulk without knowing it's going to happen. Mutant powers are different. They typically activate during adolescence whenever people are going through puberty. So they're going through a massive hormonal shift, and all of a sudden, boom, their powers activate with no warning. They don't know they're coming. And given that they're kids, there's a really decent chance they're in school or around a bunch of other kids. And so there's a very high chance that other people get injured when their powers activate. And you don't know what's going to happen. It could even be your kid. And so there's the fear from that, which that's a genuine concern. You know, I don't care how anyone else tries to rationalize it, but, you know, if your kid's sitting next to little Timmy and all of a sudden little Timmy's powers activate, and little Timmy's powers are that little Timmy has like awesome psychic abilities and your kid basically just got psychic lobotomized, like, you're probably going to take that personally. And, you know, given that there's going to be more kids on that bus that's going to happen to than there is every little Timmy that's going to happen to, the number of people that are going to naturally fear and or hate mutants as a result is going to be greater than the number of mutants. So that's just a fact. And that's, by the way, that's where the whole social allegory just completely breaks down. In the real world, minorities aren't walking around with superpowers that make them threats to the entire rest of the population. The allegory is very, very surface level. The moment you go deep in it all, the whole thing falls apart. Because whenever you have situations like that, I don't think people are entirely unjustified in being just a little bit sensitive to these topics. So, but anyway, so you have that, and that's kind of the main thing, is that mutant powers can activate in people and just wreak havoc. And then once people have their powers, unless they learn to control them, they're a threat. If they do learn to control them, they can still be a threat. And so it's so far beyond any real world example. Like, I always see people like compare it to, say, firearm ownership here in the United States. It's like, well, no, not really. Cyclops can do more damage than any gun ever will be able to that can be privately owned. So that's not really the same at all. It's a very poor analogy. There is no proper analogy, okay? Because what you're being asked to do is you're trying to weigh people's right to exist, because mutants didn't choose this, so they should be allowed to exist. That's, you know, they are, despite the whole mutant thing, they're humans, okay? They're human beings. They're the same flaws, and, you know, despite what Magneto always tries to ramble on about, mutants have the same exact drives, flaws, wants, desires, all that as human beings. You know, they're not mentally somehow more enlightened. That's bunk. I know several mutants try to go for that, but all you have to do is see that, well, that's great, but what about Sabretooth? Sabretooth is a cold-blooded killer. He's not more enlightened than anyone. He is a psychopath. Mystique is a cold-blooded killer. Magneto is a cold-blooded killer. Okay? These people are in no way, shape, or form more enlightened than anyone else. At all. Xavier's a one-off. Xavier is, even though he's done some shady things, like, the man is just short of a saint most of the time. And, Yeah, like he's the aberration. He's not the ideal. He's not the ideal. He is the ideal. He's not the norm. So, uh, so humans are scared because, unlike Spider-Man, mutants just pop up, and mutants tend to have mutant children. So, once there's mutants, there's eventually going to be more mutants, and the growth rate will be exponential. Plus, you're going to have more random additions from the random mutations from other people. Like whenever Genosha was wiped out in the E for Extinction storyline, I believe the death toll was 16 million. Now, yes, against a population of 7 billion, it's a drop in the bucket. But among 16 million, how many of them are as powerful as Magneto or Xavier? And even if they aren't, each generation, their kids should be becoming more and more powerful as each generation has the X Factor gene, and you're talking combining different powers and everything. So, yeah, you get the one-offs like Great and Creed, where Sabretooth and Mystique somehow have a human son, but they're very rare. So, humans are faced with this awesome threat, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. Okay, yes, there's the whole, hey, they're going to replace us, but that is kind of a metaphor, in my opinion, for children replacing their parents. Like, it happens, and it's going to happen. So, I understand humanity not being cool with it because there's a very clear delineation. Kind of like if the different generations like went to war with each other every so often. If you're in the older generation, you're probably going to be concerned that the younger generations being more youthful and whatnot is going to overpower you. So similar concept, except the power levels are vastly different. So you have that, and again, I think that's part. I think it's part of a metaphor in there somewhere. But here, it's more like humanity are the older people who are concerned that their kids are going to either put them in a home or shove them off a cliff. And that kind of goes into the villains, which I'll discuss in the next segment, because, just a brief preview, X-Men villains are not like other villains. Like whenever Iron Man fights the Mandarin is not out there like trying to preach Mandarin or Makluan supremacy or anything. He wants to rule the world, sure, but like he's not saying that him and his progeny are going to enslave or kill everyone else. Okay, this is not really the same thing here. I would say when Captain America fights the Red Skull, but that is in fact what the Red Skull is preaching, given that he is a German socialist from the 30s. They actually kind of were all about that. So that one's a bad example. But whenever, I don't know, whenever the Avengers are fighting, well, I can't really say Hydra because they're kind of descended from those same German socialists also. So, I don't know, when they're fighting Loki, let's go with that. Loki's not preaching Asgardian supremacy. He's not out there death to the flat scans, which I've used that phrase in a few other videos. For those of you that don't know, it has to do with when they scan people for the X Factor gene. If it doesn't register anything, a flat, like when your heart stops, you are a flat scan. You don't have the X Factor gene. You're not a mutant. It is a derogatory term that mutants use for normal humans. So, but you do have that in people like Magneto and Apocalypse, who are mutant supremacists. So, well, I'll get into Apocalypse. He's not technically a mutant supremacist. He wants to know who should be supreme. He just is betting it's going to be mutants. So, that's kind of in brief why humans fear mutants but don't fear Spider-Man or Iron Man or Captain America. These guys are one-off scientific anomalies. Yeah, maybe there's some other guy, like with Spider-Man. Sure, there's Ben Reilly, there's Silk, there's his Rogues Gallery is science gone wrong, but they're all one-offs. Like they're not starting like they're not ground zero for random people among the population gaining powers, and they all have a track record. Spider-Man has a track record of being a good guy. The Fantastic Four have a track record of being very public, very open with who they are. You have Iron Man has a long track record, eventually being open about the fact he's Tony Stark. The Avengers, they're very public. The government backs them. So the X-Men, meanwhile, they just kind of show up and start shooting laser beams and, psychic powers and everything. And no one knows where they've come from. They know that Charles Xavier seems to have some connection to them, but for the longest time, they didn't know he was a mutant. He was hiding that fact. And people are suspicious of things like that. So they have reasons to be suspicious. They have reasons to have doubts, to have fears. But as I'll get into and it's exacerbated by their villains, but as I'll talk about in part 3, the Sentinels are probably an overreaction. And I'll get into the hows and the whys of that. And what I feel would be far more rational solutions and compromises. But will never happen because comic books need drama, so. But anyway, so hopefully that answers why people fear why people fear mutants, not just the X-Men, but why they fear mutants in general. It's ultimately because they're afraid that they're going to be replaced and that it's going to happen in their lifetime. And we all know from evolution that once the superior model comes along, it tends to not have a whole hell of a lot of empathy for the last model. And so they're afraid. They're afraid they're going to be killed or put into a home or replaced. And, there's some legitimate concerns. Like, say you're an Uber driver, okay? This is your profession. And let's say someone like Nightcrawler decides that he's going to start offering his services for hire. You stand no chance of competing with that. Nightcrawler can instantaneously teleport. He will, 1, make way more money because that service is very valuable. And 2, he's going to put you out of business because if people can do that, they're not going to sit in a car. Now, it's an extreme example. You might not necessarily go out of business immediately because there's only one Nightcrawler, but let's say there's enough teleporters that eventually your services are going to be used less and less, and then you're going to be one of the people that's removed from the equation, because only a handful of people are going to be left. Because there's going to be some people that can't afford someone like Nightcrawler. They're still going to take a taxi or an Uber, but there's going to be less of them. And are you going to be one of the ones that makes it? Probably not. So that's the other kind of fear. And what do weightlifting records mean to Colossus? I mean, you kind of have that already with people like the Juggernaut and the Hulk, but I mean, they're obviously going to be disqualified. But the Juggernaut has a magic gem. I think that qualifies as unnatural enhancement. The Hulk has been unnaturally enhanced by gamma radiation. Colossus was born that way. So you have to make a carve out for the X Factor gene, and things start to get weird there too. And it's a bunch of little things like that. But again, I think a lot of it is the fear of replacement, coupled with there are plenty of mutant villains who spout off about mutant supremacy constantly and about we're going to enslave or kill mankind. Well, whenever a guy that can shut down all the electronics on the planet, who's created 2 different asteroids that for mutant safe havens in orbit around the Earth and so on, makes that claim and appears to be willing to back it up, most people are like, okay, well, spend my tax dollars on Sentinels, Senator Kelly, make me safe. And then, around and round we go. So anyway, I hope that explains why people in Marvel fear mutants but don't fear the other superheroes and villains. And so in part 2 we'll talk more about the X-Men villains and how they exacerbate the situation. Then in 3 we'll talk about the human response and why it's probably complete overkill. So anyway, hope you folks got something out of that. Comment down below what you think. Like, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. And remember, folks. Welcome to the X-Men. Hope you survive the experience.